Welcome back to this week's Parenting Parsha series, Parashat Shemot. I actually have so much to say about this week's Parsha. I've been spending what feels like a tremendous amount of time thinking about this week's Parsha. And sometimes I have themes in my week, it feels like, where it feels like everything somehow dovetails together from one idea that I heard from one person or something that I was discussing with a client to a book that I was reading to a different podcast that I was listening to. And I kept having this feeling that all these different things that I was listening to was somehow kind of coalescing into this one theme, and it's somehow all related to the Parsha. I don't know if it actually does, but I think that I might have created some cohesive thought that might be a meaningful takeaway for all of us in terms of thinking about our children, in terms of thinking about ourselves, and in terms of thinking about this week's Parsha, and maybe what's going on in the world around us. And so before I move on to the next screen, I guess I want to just share one story that I thought was so beautiful that perhaps could be a jumping off point for our discussion of Parashat Shemot, and really thinking about where it leaves us at the end of Parashat Vayechi and where we're going in this week's Parsha, and really this book, this Sefer. We know that the other name for Sefer Shemot is Sefer Geula, the book of redemption. We're taken out of Mitzrayim, right? Last week's Parsha ends with us being in Mitzrayim. Yosef dies, Yaakov dies, not in that order. And then we start off in this week's Parsha with the slavery of Paro, and ultimately we move throughout the book of Shemot to the Exodus from Egypt. And I was listening Rav Rosner, who gives a lot of wonderful shiurim, but in his Parsha shiur last week, he related what I thought was a most poignant story. He was saying how he heard last week when somebody went to get their vaccine in Israel. Israel is doing an amazing job of their vaccine rollout, Baruch Hashem. As the whole vaccine experience is really a nace from Hashem. And when the person went to go get their vaccine, it was a man. He looked seemingly dati. He maybe had a kippah on his head. And the nurse who was administering the vaccine, the person didn't automatically necessarily assume was a dati or observant nurse. But when she went to give him the vaccine, she said to him, "Would you like me to give the vaccine in your right arm or in your left arm?" And he's like, "It doesn't matter." She says, "Why do you ask?" He says, "Why do you ask?" So he says, she says to him, "Well, I just want to let you know that the vaccine really hurts your arm. And so you may not want to wrap your tefillin. You may not want to get the shot on your left arm because it might hurt you tomorrow morning when you go to wrap tefillin." And Rav Rosner pointed it out in terms of basically Mika Amcha Yisrael, but also this idea of recognition that the end of Sefer of Bereshit really ends with us experiencing our first galut, and the reminder that Yosef sets for himself about the fact that our eyes should always be looked to Eretz Yisrael, even in the fact that he makes some promise to bring his bones out, and we know that that is a promise that is fulfilled, and it's very explicit, that our eyes are always looked towards Israel and to our true homeland, despite the current circumstance that we find ourselves in. And it really got my mind going and starting to think about all different various geulot that people have been in. And one thing that I was reading about this week, which dovetailed with a podcast that I was listening to, was, for me at least, when I think of a galut that is, and a shibud, like a slavery that is most relevant in my own family. I think of my grandfather, who was a survivor of many camps. He was taken early in the war, and he was liberated in Auschwitz. And I oftentimes think about the Holocaust. And I think about the fact that in my early years, aside from my own experience with my grandfather, and I was recently talking to somebody else, I was talking to Rachel Wald about this, that one of the things that I always think about when I think about my grandfather is that despite the fact that he was somebody who saw the worst of humanity, he always believed in humanity being good, and that they had the capacity for evil, but they also had the capacity for great goodness. And one of the things that always struck me about people and authors who were Holocaust survivors, at least in the books that maybe I gravitated towards, were this idea of making meaning, whether it was Viktor Frankl, this idea that you could tell the people who walked through the camps looking for people who needed more encouragement, who needed more love, this idea that every opportunity is an opportunity for optimism and making meaning in one's life. And then I happen to have recently read a book by Edith Eger. She also wrote this book, which I'm in the middle of, thanks to Ariel Wiener giving me a great tip about it, The Gift, 12 Lessons to Save Your Life. And in it, she also talks about this idea of making meaning and true freedom. And she points out, and it really also made me think of my grandfather, she points out that she too basically was liberated after in the middle of the Auschwitz death walk. And my grandfather recalls with vivid memory saying that they were on this death march and they all fell asleep at the end of a long, horrible day, not knowing if they would survive the next day, and kind of collapsed into some barn. And they woke up the following morning and everybody was gone. All the Nazis were gone. They had all evacuated in the night. And she relates this idea that despite the fact that they were now quote unquote free, they had no idea what freedom meant, because freedom is not just being free. It's not just the ability to go places and choose where you want to go. It's about creating meaning in your life and having meaningful experiences, and the belief that you can have meaningful experiences. And it got me thinking about this idea of boredom. And Baruch Hashem, I guess you could say Bamikra, I happen to have listened to a podcast this week about boredom. And I didn't love everything she said, but I thought that, because I thought she was missing an integral part. She's a social psychologist, and she was talking about a study that they had done with boredom. And basically what they did was they took a group of people and they told them that we're going to put you in a room for an extended period of time and you'll have nothing to do. And all you will have at your disposal, for lack of a better terminology, is an ability to shock yourself. And they gave them, the ability to do a trial shock. And each one of them said, yeah, this hurts. I don't really like this. This isn't pleasurable. I would even pay for somebody not to do this. And despite that, with overwhelming majority, when they put people in a room with nothing else to do, it was shocking, no pun intended, how often people were resorting to shocking themselves. The experience of being by themselves with nothing to do was extraordinarily distressing to them, to the point in which they were willing to shock themselves. And so she had a lot of explanations as to why she thought that was. And she related it to the current pandemic situation in which you're hearing people talk about this feeling of being bored and trapped. I think the piece that she was missing is that I oftentimes think when you hear people talk about this and say, I'm so bored, or I can't stand being bored, some of it has to do with what she's suggesting, which is that it's an opportunity to ask yourself, well, are you not being engaged in things that are meaningful to you? And if you're not, how can you actually find meaning in this moment or in this day so that what you are doing does have meaning? So do you need to expand your repertoire to doing things that are engaging and meaningful in whatever circumstance you're finding yourself in? Separately from that, I also think, though, she was missing a piece, which is that oftentimes people have a very difficult time being by themselves and alone and quiet, because when they're alone and quiet, people who are maybe naturally more not optimistic, or maybe more sad, or maybe more depressed, or maybe more anxious, they find the flooding of their thoughts to be so overwhelming that they would rather have something to occupy them so they don't have to attend to the thoughts that are going on in their head. And so I think there's a lot of important lessons for this, because oftentimes, whether it's ourselves or more oftentimes maybe our kids, and they wander in, and inevitably the three among the worst words, I'm so bored, and you just want to be like, oh my God, how could you possibly be bored? Or then you think to yourself like, okay, well, what would make you unbored? And sometimes we want to take a step back and ask ourselves, well, what does that mean that our kids are bored? Are they using the word boredom because it's a word that they know and they're familiar with? But that's actually not what they're trying to convey. They're actually maybe trying to say, I don't know what to do with myself right now, or I'm having a hard time activating, or if I go into that room, this kid is going to annoy me and I don't want to set myself up. I think a lot of times kids and people use simplistic words to be in the place of articulating something that is actually really going on. And so I actually think that helping people, ourselves, modeling it, children, use time in a meaningful way is actually very critical. So sometimes that's why I oftentimes suggest to parents, it's okay to give kids a suggestion of 3 different things that they might want to engage themselves in. It could be reading a book, it could be playing a game, it could be coloring, it could be playing with Lego. And I think that it's an important piece to actually have some of the options and activities be things that they do alone, the ability to learn how to be alone with themselves. This idea of being able to go to a coffee shop and sit there by yourself and drink a cup of coffee, and maybe you bring a book and maybe you read it, or maybe you don't, and maybe you people watch, and maybe you just take a few minutes to try to take a few deep breaths and allow yourself to be with yourself. And I think it's a balancing act between recognizing that you need to be able to tolerate being with yourself, and at the same time asking yourself, if I'm feeling bored, is that also a result of the fact that I'm not using my time in a way that makes me feel like I'm engaging in meaningful behaviors? What does this have to do with Parsha? So I think it has to do with Parsha, not just from the perspective of Shibud, not just from the perspective of the fact that it's hard to relate to this idea. In other words, you only recognize true freedom when meaning the ability to be bored is to some degree a consequence of having true freedom. Although one could argue, perhaps very cogently and appropriately, that in the pandemic where people didn't have the freedom to leave their home, that's when they actually felt the most bored. And so they felt the most trapped. But oftentimes when we think about the idea of shibud, whether it was Mitzrayim, whether it's the Holocaust, whatever it is, you're so physically you have no ownership over yourself and over your time that you don't even have the luxury of boredom because you actually can't even stop to rest. And so what in the world could this possibly have to do with this parsha? It really got me thinking about a little bit. And I did spend, I think there's so much more rich material out there. And I'm just like, actually just clearly, as we usually do, just like skimming the surface of what's available. And so I encourage people to think about this more. I started going on Safari and just typing in Ra'atzon and seeing what came up and really using it as a springboard to think. But we know that our leaders oftentimes come back to the idea of sheep and come back to the idea of being a shepherd, right? We know that Hevel was a shepherd. Hashem accepted Hevel's korban. We know that the brothers were shepherds. We know that, the list, Yaakov was a shepherd, David is a shepherd, Moshe is a shepherd. There's something very important about this idea of leadership and being a shepherd. And I just put a few different pieces here in the Malbim and in the Kliyakar, just to point out kind of this idea that there's a lot of different levels and ways of understanding. Perhaps the idea, and I think like the classical way of understanding why it's so important to be a shepherd is this idea that you know how to take care of others. You're always being mindful. You never let one sheep wander off, right? Just the same way that Moshe would never let one person in Bnei Yisrael wander off. We care about not just the group, but also the individuals, and that if he was a good shepherd who is mindful of somebody else's sheep in the way in which that he would have been mindful of his own sheep, so Hashem felt like he was capable of being a warm, positive leader for the Jewish people, thinking about this idea that when he goes to the burning bush, that this sheep had wandered off and Moshe went after him to get him to take and to bring him back. This idea of caring, this idea of being mindful and a certain awareness. And there's something very, I think the perception of shepherds is that they're calm. And so it's interesting to think about, because I'm not sure if we would actually describe Moshe as calm, but I think his high degree of patience, his ability to like stick with it, even when things are hard, because I imagine that herding sheep is not exactly a simple task, though I've never done it. I think it requires a great deal of patience. But I also think one of the things that struck me that maybe is why potentially there is this idea, and we do see this in the Mefarshim, about this idea of hitbodedut, that being a shepherd is lonely. And there's a lot of quiet time and perhaps a lot of boring time, right? You look at a shepherd, they're wandering the pastures with nobody to talk to except for the sheep and maybe a dog. And there's a lot of thinking time, right? You can't necessarily shepherd sheep and read a book. You can't necessarily, maybe nowadays you could shepherd sheep and listen to a podcast, but you have to be aware of your settings and being thoughtful. And there's a certain amount of the fact that like, you can't be doing lots of other things. You can't actually be multitasking. And so there's an idea that it's like actually quiet, and perhaps there's a capacity where you're just by yourself, like it might be very boring inducing. And perhaps one of the characteristics that we see from our leaders, from Moshe, from Yosef, from Yaakov, from David, is this ability to tolerate the experience of being alone and to create meaning in it. That it was in those quiet moments that they developed their relationship with Hashem, that they developed a relationship and an awareness of Hashem and like a higher being. And like we even see when David first comes to the battlefield, the thing that he's so shocked about is that like, why are we allowing these people to denigrate Hashem? And like he gives like a whole like speech about this, and like then he like charges into the field. And so this idea of being vulnerable, and I think that that's also something that probably comes from shepherds. You recognize that if you're not on top of it, it's a very vulnerable inducing experience. And it's interesting to think about even just in our own sense when we think about going before Hashem on Yom Kippur, right? We imagine ourselves to be sheep, to be vulnerable. And I think that like this mindset of a leader who's on the one hand capable of quiet, capable of using the quiet time and not scared of it, and able to utilize it to think about the world, to think about their role, to think about a way in which to use this time in their lives to create meaning, I think is an extraordinarily powerful thing. But I think also at the same time, it's a balancing act between using moments in time to actually create meaning. So it's the ability to tolerate quiet and at the same time create meaning that I think is so powerful. And I think that like that is such a wonderful message and such an important conversation to get started and talking about with our children, because I think so many times we're just going, right? We're over programming, and I think that was probably part of the problem with pandemic. People didn't know what to do with themselves when we took away all the over programming, when we took away all the extras. They were always so busy running to, here, and from. And some people found it meaningful, and some people found it very hard. Some people found it very anxiety provoking. Some people found it very depressing. And I think it's okay, right? Because that's our real feelings. And I think that we want to work through those real feelings. I don't think we need to run away from them. But I think it's important to process them and to talk about them in a way that's age appropriate, in a way that we've thought about ourselves. And I always think these are good conversations to first have with our spouses sometimes, and kind of get on the same page in terms of what we're thinking about them. Not that our opinions always have to align, because I think it's good for kids to see that, like, you know, two people who love each other and who are building the same home might have different opinions about something and have different viewpoints about something. That's like good grist for the mill in terms of how those relationships are built. But I also think in terms of thinking about how to present it, and I think it's always the case when we talk about things, we're able to formulate things in a much more thoughtful, meaningful way. And I also really just think about this idea of like helping kids to create meaning with boredom and encouraging kids to take responsibility for their own quote unquote boredom, I think is really critical. Not like always rushing to overprogram them, but allowing them to be like, hey, you know, sometimes today is a day where we're not doing a lot of things, but what could you do to make today feel like a fun day for you, or a good day for you, or feel like it was like a meaningful day for you? And I think that that's an important thing. And not every day is going to be intensely meaningful. It could just be meaningful, like, oh, I learned one thing, or I took a look at this and this was interesting to me. It doesn't always have to be grand ideas. Okay, Parsha Crafts. Guys, people have told me that it's going to get tricky, and I am determined to push through. So I'm looking for lots and lots of great ideas. I love this idea of shepherd's pie. I mentioned it to Eitan today, just saying to him, I'm thinking about making shepherd's pie for Friday night. He's like, oh, great, that sounds delicious. I was like, okay, but also, like, you get it? He's like, get what? I'm like, shepherd's pie, this week's Parasha. He's like, seriously? So I love it, but maybe it's not going to resonate with everybody else. This easy breezy Sunday school cup with like flames coming out of it, I think in place of flames, you could put peppers, like different colored peppers coming out of it, or somehow it reminded me of like taro chips. Like if you craft up taro chips and put it inside and even just like print it out a tree, or like gave the kids as like a Friday afternoon project, that could be like excellent to do, and might be something you could put on your Shabbos tables for dips or whatever, just eating. I like the Moshe fruit basket. I have not decided if this is like ridiculous, tenable, or a total waste of money. It's a potential possibility that I may attempt some version of it, but to be very clear, I also might outsource some of it. So this like needs like further sarich iyun about whether or not this is actually manageable. I'm thinking that's a sweet potato head, just FYI, in case people are trying to figure out what that is. I think it's a sweet potato, but it could be something else, and then they put grapes in the eyes. Moshe B'Teva, I think there's like a million million things to do with this. I'm not sure I'm into Jello, but I think that people could do Jello. There seems to also be like maybe melted chocolate. I'm thinking maybe more cupcakes. I love the Burning Bush cupcake. That looks fun and easy. If you need some decorating tips, text me, email me. I'm available to give you. It's actually not as hard as it looks, and I will give you some quick hacks to make it a little bit easier. The Moshe Bateva, just FYI, it looks like they took some type of chocolate candy, turned it upside down, used the flat side, and then put some type of bear and like just like squished like blue, like frosting over it. I think it looks manageable. Making a teva out of Rice Krispie treats looks like a challenge to me. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in my house, but I encourage you to give it a try. I love down there that baby Moshe being wrapped up in blue, in blue sour sticks. So this is some of the ideas that I came up with for this week's Parsha. I think there's lots of things you could probably do. You could probably do pyramids. I didn't think about pyramids. You could probably do like cool things on pyramids. But these are some of the ideas that I came up with, and I hope other people come up with fun ideas. And whatever you do, try to save and put somewhere for Pesach. Do you believe it? Pesach is sort of around the corner, but not really around the corner, thank God. We first, Baruch Hashem, have to get to Tu B'Shvat and to Purim, and then we will get onto Pesach, but always good things to keep in the back of your head if it's a Pesach-friendly item, which maybe the Moshe Bateva might be. The other ones might be a little trickier. Anyways, Shabbat Shalom. I hope it's a great week, and I can't wait to hear what people do.